Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for being here today. Today we're going to be talking about my worst books of 2020 and also my most disappointing books of 2020. I decided to compile the two together because a lot of the books that ended up on my worst books were also on my most disappointing books. I figured let's just do it all in one go. Let's combine the two videos together. So as always, if you like this video, make sure you like it and subscribe if you want to, and let's get into it. I feel like I should preface this by saying that when I mean disappointing books, I don't mean that they were bad books. Some of them were bad. You know, I'm not gonna lie about that, but as a book lover, a booktube watcher, and as a booktuber now, I do a lot of watching, a lot of research about books that I feel like are gonna be interesting. So I watch a certain video and, you know, the synopsis sounds perfect to me. It sounds like it's gonna be one of my favorites of all time and whatnot. And then once I read the book, I don't feel like what I felt when I read the synopsis, and I felt like I was meeting it for the first time and that it was a good one. It really just did not wow me or exceed my expectations. So that doesn't mean that these books were necessarily bad. It just means that I had expectations that weren't met by those books. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that I'm shitting on these books in any way. Some of them I will shit on because some of them are pretty bad. But either way, even with that being said, if I don't like a certain book, it doesn't mean that it's a bad book. It means that we all have different tastes as readers. We all have different things that we want out of books as readers. And I am not trying to offend you in any way. And also, disappointing books do not mean that they're bad. They just mean that they're not my favorite books. Okay? There's no tea in this video. There's nothing I want to say negative about the disappointing books. I'm just saying that they did not wow me or exceed those expectations in any way. Okay? Now that's out there. Also, I don't have copies of these books anymore because I've gotten rid of them. I don't keep books unless I plan on rereading them. So all these books on my shelves are mostly unread books. So I don't have these books anymore, so I always put a photo so you can see the cover, but yeah, I don't own them anymore. So let's get into it. So first up for this, we're gonna do the disappointing books first. So the first one we have is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. This is a book about a girl named Alice and her mother, and both of them are estranged from Alice's grandmother, who is a very famous author for publishing fairy tales from a place called the Hinterland. And one day, when Alice's mother goes missing, a person leaves Alice a note saying that it is a person from the Hinterland that kidnapped her and that Alice has to go into the Hinterland to find her mother. And as on the way, she seeks help from a man named Ellery, who was one of Althea's, her grandmother's, biggest fans for the Hinterland, and basically about trying to get her mother back. Which sounds amazing. I read that synopsis and I was like, wow, I really want to read that book. It sounds like it's up my alley. It's very dark, very fairy tale-ish, very spooky in some parts, and it really did not perform well for me. The first half of the book was a contemporary style book. It wasn't a fantasy book that was what I wanted it to be. So the first half was a contemporary, and Alice's character was just so awful. She was such a hypercritical person of everyone else besides herself, even when she is so far from perfect and so not a good person. And what really made me angry is that she sought Ellery's help to help her find the Hinterland because Ellery was very well versed on Althea's books, but treated him like shit the whole time when all he was trying to do was help her. And that really just made me angry because it's just like, I read it and I'm like, you know what, like, I like feeling emotions in books even if it is anger, but not towards the character for doing shitty things. So that was my thing. I gave that book a 3.5 stars, so it wasn't a bad rating. I think that the main thing I did like about it was that it's a very flowery writing and it's very metaphorical, which I like a lot in books, but that really is like the only thing that I liked out of that book. And yeah. I have a second book. I plan on reading it, but I plan on not setting my expectations high enough for that book. Next we have Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, which may come as a surprise to most people because I feel like people who don't like John Green's other works end up liking Turtles All the Way Down, but I really didn't like that book. I gave it like 2.5 to 3 stars, I think. This was a while ago, so I may not remember a lot from these books, but it's about a girl named Asa who has anxiety and OCD, and it's basically about her life in high school, and one of her friends ends up, I don't know, like finding $1 million or something, and they end up deciding what to do with the money. It's a typical John Green type book where it doesn't really have a plot or that kind of stuff. It's mostly just dialogue and weird teenager stuff that isn't relevant to how teenagers actually are. So, from reading reviews from that thing, the people who had OCD said that OCD was pretty well represented in that book, so they didn't feel like it was misconstrued in any way. As someone with anxiety, I feel like the anxiety rep was a pretty good representation of it, so that's good for me. That's another plus for that book. But one thing that I really don't like in YA books is when you clearly have an older author trying to create dialogue for teenagers and completely missing the mark. Like, John Green makes his teenagers sound like they are so hipstery and like so adult-like in a way. Like, he writes them to be like, I've never heard a teenager talk in the same way that John Green writes the teenagers to talk. Like, as someone who just went out of teenagerhood into young, well, I'm 20 years old, so I don't know if you consider me a teenager still, but, and none of my friends ever spoke in the way that John Green's characters do. And it's like, we're not a different species of people, we're simply just young adults, and we don't talk the way that you try to make it out to be, you know? Like, it makes me angry. That's why I don't think I like John Green's books anymore, because I feel like it's just so unrealistic to how teenagers actually are, and like, I hate it. I hate that. Also, Daisy is like the best friend in that book, and I just absolutely hated her. I could not like give that book a bigger, like, I had to dock it down just because of how annoying Daisy was, and how I hate it when the main characters in books don't stick up for themselves to their best friends. It's just like, no, I couldn't do it. Could not do it. I gave it like 3 stars, I think, but yeah, I think that I have finally reached the point where I have grown out of John Green's books, and it's sad, but my phase for that man is over, and that's okay. Next we have The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I think it's how you pronounce it. This is a thriller book about a man who is very interested in a certain patient at a mental hospital who stabbed her husband a bunch of times and has not spoken since that incident. And no one really knows why he has such a fascination with her, but he makes sure to be in the same mental hospital as her, like working in there, so that he can talk to her and be a therapy person for her. I gave this book 3 stars, I think, as well. I am not a seasoned thriller mystery reader, so the fact that I was able to predict what the twist was is pretty sad. It wasn't like, it took me by no surprise. I was just kind of like, oh, I kind of saw that coming, you know, like, it was just whatever. And I feel like because the author had focused so much on the twist in the end and the whole big reveal about what was happening in that book, everything else before that point just got so jumbled and nonsensical to where it was hard to get through that book. I read a review from someone who works as a mental health professional, and she said that Michaelides did not do a good job researching medicines and treatments and therapy and stuff like that. Like, one of the medications that the main character was taking put her in like a drug-induced haze, and the actual drug that was referenced in that book does not do that to patients at all. I feel like if you're going to talk about treatment and medications and being in a mental ward, at least do enough research to get the medications right. It's not very hard to research medications, and I feel like it just stigmatized treatment and medication and being in a mental ward in the first place. So I did not like this book. I think I may drop the rating lower as I'm talking to you about it right now, because I feel like the more I talk about it, the more I just don't like it. So yeah. Next we have Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is a adult Greek mythology retelling about Cersei, who is, I don't really know if she's a god. I don't know. She's the son, not the son, oh my god, the daughter of a god, Helios, I think, and his wife, and she's not a god or anything, but basically about how she was exiled from her parents and lives on an island by herself and is basically a witch. So, not a witch, she practices witchcraft. I gave this book, I think I gave it 4 stars, so it wasn't a bad book. That's what I'm saying. Like, 4 stars is a very good rating for books. It just, I expected it to be a 5-star read it, and I expected it to be in like my top 10 favorite books of all time, and it wasn't. Like, I feel like there was no plot to the story. Everything was just kind of like a long, like, drawn out, flowy story, which isn't a bad thing, but when I read books, like, I don't want that, you know? And I really love Cersei as a character. I thought that she was such an amazing character, and I really, really felt for her, and I related to her so much, and that was why I gave it 4 stars. There were still some parts of the book where I was just taken aback and just being like, that is so amazing, and like, I was like so emotional about it, but still, like, I had to take into account that it was, like, there was no plot. Like, there was no rising, falling, like, climax or anything. It was just the story of Cersei, which is still an interesting story, but it's just not, it was still disappointing to me in that way. You know? And hopefully you understand what I'm talking about, because I feel like I talk too much sometimes. Okay. Next we have You by Caroline Kepnes. This is another thriller. Starting to think that maybe thrillers aren't my genre, right? If you don't know what this book is about, it's a book about a man named Joe who has very crazy issues, and he meets a woman in a bookstore one day and instantly becomes obsessed with her and stalks her, and the book is told in like, I forgot what it's called, but it's told as if he's talking to you. So he says, you go into a bookstore, you do this, you do that. And that part was interesting, but I feel like it wasn't a mystery thriller book. It really wasn't. Like, I feel like it was just a story about a man who has such deep-seated issues and who is also extremely horny. So I didn't like that. It was like very overly sexualized, and keep in mind, I love me some smut. I love it, but when I go into a book and want a mystery thriller aspect and it really is just a smut-filled book about someone who has really deep-seated issues, it was not what I wanted at all. So that's gonna be a no from me. I may watch the show because I heard that it's a really good show, but in terms of the books, I have a second book again, but once again, I am not putting my expectations high for that second book either. Next we have Rooms by Lauren Oliver. This is a adult fiction book or fantasy book about a man named, what's his name? What is his name? Richard Miller, I think, who has recently died, and no, his name is Richard Walker, sorry, who has recently died, and his family, who is estranged, moves in, or goes back to their childhood home to basically clean everything out, get the will sorted out, and then sell the house, basically. And we also follow the point of views of two ghosts who live in that house still and have very troubled past. Reading that synopsis, I was blown away. I was like, I have to read that book. I have never heard of a book told from a ghost point of view about a haunted house, and I was like, that's just gonna sound amazing. And if it was just centered around the ghost point of view, it would have been a 5-star book. But the people who were still alive, it went back to that house, who were Richard Walker's family, were awful. They were horrible people, and I hated them so much. And like, reading through their point of view chapters was like pulling teeth. Like, I was like, can I just get back to the ghost point of view? Because their backstories were so much more interesting and so much more fun to read about. But then you got to the chapters where it was through the mother's point of view and the daughter's, and I was like, I cannot stand this. Like, I wanted to skip those chapters, but I couldn't because I can't do that, obviously. So I was just like, no. I gave it 2 stars because of that reason. I also feel like there was no... And then the timelines of the ghost and the actual alive characters didn't connect in any way, so there's no reason to have both of those things in one book, I think. But they weren't connected, so I don't really know what Lauren Oliver's intentions were behind this book, but it didn't make sense in that way. So it was really disappointing for me because it just sounded right up my alley. So once again, it's sad. And then a surprise for most people, They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera, which I am actually so scared to talk about because this has made my worst books of 2020 list too. And it seems like everyone likes this book besides me. So this is about, our main character's name are Mateo and... I don't know what the other guy's name is. I'm sorry. It's set in the future, and there's something called Death Cast, which is where you get called on your last day to live and they say, hey, just so you know you're gonna die today, I'm sorry, but there's no avoiding it. You're going to die today. So our main character's name is Mateo, and he goes onto a forum for people who are death dayers, basically, and connects with another boy who is also going to die that same day, and their 2 timelines end up crossing and they spend their last day together on Earth. Once again, with the older authors trying to create dialogue with teenagers that is just so outlandish and unrealistic for them, and that was like my main thing. Like, I kept reading certain points of view and I was just like, you do not talk like a normal teenager does. Like, I don't know, it just bugs me so much and I just don't like it. So also, I found Mateo's character to be so annoying, and it was hard for me to get through his chapters, and I really couldn't get a connection within the characters because of the fact that I knew that they were going to die at the end. Which is kind of the point. Like, you're not getting spoilers for anything, but I feel like when I already know that they're going to die, I kind of turn off my thing where I want to connect with them. And also the romance in the book was so unnecessary. It did not need to happen. So yeah, I gave that book like 2.5 stars, I think. I really did not like it, so I'm sorry if you did. I am not trying to shit on your favorite book, but I didn't like it. Another surprise for everyone else too. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a adult contemporary book, or I guess historical fiction book, about a band during the 70s and them coming together and their eventual downfall. It wasn't that interesting. Like, the most parts felt okay. I wish it was centered more around Karen because she's a way cooler character than Daisy is, but the good parts were good, but they weren't worth it to get through the boring parts of the book. Because a lot of the book was boring. I feel like nothing happened for like 50 pages, and I was like, okay. And then when I got to the good parts, it was like, that wasn't worth it. That build-up wasn't worth it for me, and I just didn't like the book. And I know that some people love this book, and I get it. I didn't like it, and it wasn't as heartbreaking as everyone that I follow said that it was. Like, I was not affected by what happened at the end of the book. I did not care about the end of the book. So yeah, I gave that book like 3 stars. It still was an okay book. I just think that I overall wasted my time with it. Next we have This Is Where It Ends by Marieke Nijkamp, and I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm so sorry, which is about a school shooter and the kids that were affected by it on the day of the school shooting. So it follows an entire day of different POVs from the school shooter to the kids who are affected by it. I think that it was a good book. I gave it 3 stars. There wasn't enough emotion behind it. And I feel like as it only centered around one day and I only got a view of the characters through that one day, I couldn't connect to them like on a deeper level and be upset when some of them did die. Also, what really bugged me too was the way that it handled grief. It was like, the very end of the book, it was kind of like wrapped up like a pretty little bow where it's like, oh, we're all gonna be okay and we're gonna get over it. And that's just not realistic to how kids react to that kind of stuff. Like, you know, as someone who has experienced loss in her life, like, I don't think that I have ever reacted to grief in that way. And I don't think that I would ever just be like, oh, it happens, we're gonna be okay. Like, I feel like that was just so unrealistic and just so unfair to the characters. And I really did not like that at all. You should read it. It wasn't really like, I didn't cry, I think I did cry at one point in the book. I think I cried at the very end, but either way, I was not like as affected by it because I feel like the author's writing wasn't emotional enough to actually invoke that kind of feeling within me, if that makes sense. Next we have The Astonishing Collaborator by Emily X.R. Pan, which I am so upset that this book is on this list. I am so upset about it. I wanted to love this book, and okay, I gave it 4 stars. Once again, a really good rating for a book, but the way that I wanted this book to be is how I wanted it to be like what a Monster Calls is to me, which, if you don't know, A Monster Calls is my #1 book of all time, and it wasn't that. And that's kind of unfair to the book, and I understand that, but I should probably explain to you what that book is about first, shouldn't I? Yeah, let's do that. It's about this girl named, I forgot her name. Do I have brain cells in my brain? Her mother has recently committed suicide, and she believes that her mother has turned into a bird, and she feels like her mother is drawing her to go, or telling her to go to Taiwan to meet her grandparents who she has never met or seen before. And she feels like if she goes to Taiwan, she'll find her mother and be able to release her to the world, basically. And I loved it. I really did love the book. It just wasn't what I wanted it to be. And it's as simple as that. Like, it's just, there's no gripes with it. I just feel like it didn't do what I needed it to do for me, and that's fine. I still loved the book, and I still really did enjoy it. It's as simple as the fact that I just didn't love it that much. I didn't love it as much as I wanted to, which is fine. That's kind of what happens when you read and you have a reading journey, is that you're gonna be disappointed sometimes, and that's completely okay. And then lastly, we have The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslie Walton, which is a book about a girl named Ava Lavender, and it follows her mother and her grandmother's timeline of their lives, and Ava is born with wings and going through the story of Ava's life as well. The writing was so pretty and whimsical. I gave this book 3 stars, I think. The historical parts of the novel weren't distinguished enough because it goes through, you know, multiple timelines, and I feel like I was constantly confused about where we were in the book and what time period it was, and I just felt like I couldn't distinguish it enough. I also just couldn't relate to the characters and their actions, and found some parts really, really gross, like disgusting. Like depictions of sexual assault and rape, and how everything was so weirdly sexual in this book. Like talking about how a 13-year-old boy almost got sexually assaulted because he was too tall and looked older than what he really was. And I read that and I was disgusted by it. So just know going into that there is trigger warnings for rape, sexual assault, like graphic depictions of like gore, and wasn't pertinent to the plot and everything else. Like, it was just overall disgusting. Overall, it was a beautifully written book, and it was a good enough story, but it didn't meet my expectations. So now we're gonna get into the worst books of 2020, and I'm going to rank those in least disliked to most disliked. The disappointing books were not ranked in any way, shape, or form, just so you know. So we're gonna go 1 is the least disliked, and I think I have 6 here, is the most disliked, and I don't have like a certain number. I picked all of the books 2 stars and below that I really did not like. So first off, we have Life and Death by Stephanie Meyer. Gave this book 2 stars. It is a gender-bent Twilight where Bella's role is played by a male and Edward's role is played by a female. And I really just picked this up on a whim. Like, I found it at Target and I was like, oh, I didn't know that Stephanie Meyer came out with that book, so I picked it up and I read it. And I hated it. Like, I really did. I just found it so boring. And, you know, I knew that it wasn't just the fact that, like, it didn't have the same flavor that Twilight did, because I recently reread Twilight too, and I loved it, and I always loved Twilight, but that book was just boring, and that's really just what it boils down to. It was just a boring book, and it did not have anything that the original Twilight books had in it, which I'm not surprised about, but it's whatever. I'm just kind of like, whatever about it at this point. That's why it's on the bottom of the list. Next we have Clock Dance by Anne Tyler, which is a book about a girl named Willa, and she has never really lived a life for herself and has had everything planned out for her, and until one day she receives a phone call saying that her son's ex-girlfriend has gotten shot and she needs her help, and Willa flies across the country to go and help her heal and help her daughter. Let's get into the bad stuff about it. So Willa's sons and every single male character in her life besides her father were dicks, like, and I hated that. And Willa never stood up for herself and never lived a life that was her own and never said no to people, and I just hated that. It just made me so angry. And when she finally has a chance to be with people who are going to love her and care for her and be nice to her, she goes back to her shitty life, and I just can't understand Willa's character. I really can't. I don't like it when there's a motorcycle going on outside right now. Of course there is. It'll be over now. So I really don't like it when women characters are written that way in a book, that makes them so weak-willed, and the book wasn't good enough to justify the fact that I hated Willa's character. So, in the third spot, it's They Both Die at the End, which was previously stated in the other video. I'm not going to go over it again because that would just make this video way too long, but that took the third spot for the worst books of 2020. 4 is Rooms, once again, previously stated in another video. Earlier in the video. So 5, we have A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. This is a book about a man named Alexander Rostov, who is a poet living during the time of the Bolsheviks' Russia, when they had just conquered Russia. So he had released some anti-Bolshevik poetry, and they said, I'm not going to, and the Bolsheviks caught him and said that I'm not going to kill you, but I'm going to sentence you to house arrest for the rest of your life, to the Metropole Hotel, that was when he was like 30 years old, so we go until he's like 70 years old throughout the book, and that was just too much. Too much of the story was told, whereas I wanted to experience it along with a character, and I wanted to experience the dialogues, and I feel like there was just too much put into one book that really just made me want to scream. That was like a 500-page book, and it took me 9 days to read that book. That has never happened to me before in my entire life. I could only stomach 50 pages per day. That's all I could do, because I could not mentally hold on for longer than that, because there was just so much going on in that book, and so much pretentious writing and the character just being pretentious himself, and I just could not stand it, and a whole lot of nothing happened. And as someone who is, you know, as we all are in the pandemic still, reading about someone who's on house arrest doesn't really appeal to me right now, and I don't know if that's really what happened to. I feel like even if the world was back to normal, I still wouldn't enjoy that book anyways. So yeah, I just could not stand that book at all. Which, if you've watched my wrap up from, I don't even know what month it is, you would know that I didn't like that book. And then the number 1 spot for the worst book of 2020 goes to Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Berendt, which comes to no surprise for anyone. This is the only 1 star that I gave out this year, so it makes sense why it's on this list. This is a book about the author actually moved to Savannah, Georgia, and he met people, and he basically wrote a book about his experiences with those people, but one of them happened to murder someone. So yeah, this is labeled as a true crime book. It's not a true crime book. Trust me, it's not. I went through about 250 pages without even hearing mention of the murder. the murder only happened for about 5 pages, and talk of the murder happened like every 50 pages for like 5 pages again. So there was not based around the murder at all. It was based around like a contemporary, around people who live in Savannah who are also very very racist, very transphobic, and very homophobic, which I don't even know why he included that in that book, but it was disgusting. And the fact that like he didn't like just, the whole thing is that, you know, what really makes me angry too is that I feel like Savannah has such a big black population there that he could have easily touched on and easily wrote like experiences about, but he didn't. And it's mostly about white people who hate people who aren't like them. So there was a trans person in this book who one of the people in the book, who was a real person, talked shit about the entire book and was being awful to the entire book. Homophobia, very rampant in this book, blatant racism in this book, and John Barrett didn't do anything to dismiss the fact that those weren't his beliefs, and that he never talked about how he ever stood up to those people for being that way. Like, he just didn't care about the fact that they were like that. And that's what made me so angry, because I would read it and there'd be no true crime in the book, and also he had this shitty people that he was writing about, but not about the actual people that were good in that book. And I hated it, and I did not like it at all, and getting through that book was annoying. It was a 380-page book of racism and homophobia, transphobia, and not even good true crime stuff in the first place. So, did not like it. I feel like if you want to experience a story, they say watch the movie. That's probably the only instance where you're going to want to watch the movie over reading the book. I'm not going to watch the movie because I don't care enough about the story, but yeah. That took the #1 spot for the worst book in 2020, and I'm glad that I never had to see that book ever again in my entire life. So, that's great. Anyway, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I'm sorry if I did not like some of your favorite books. Once again, it's just because my experience is different than yours, and I hope that's okay. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one, and then hopefully my next video is going to be a more positive one. That's going to be my top favorite books of 2020. So yeah, I'll see you in that video. Goodbye.